Well, hello and welcome to Midweek Mashup. Today I'm sitting down with Pastor Eric, who kicked off our series on the names of God.
Names of God. Nog.
Nog. That is the acronym. We nogged it up this Sunday. You may notice that our studio looks a little different. We're moving some things around, so TBD, TBA. Stay tuned for what it's going to look like.
Right.
Yeah. But we kicked off our Names of God series.
Yes.
Why is that an important thing to talk about?
So the series is ultimately about, especially in the Old Testament, names are really important. Mm-hmm. Names of the people that they're given or that they're renamed to mm-hmm. tell a huge part of their story, mm-hmm. right? And the names that God gives for himself or reveals of himself, or people name God based on their experiences with God, usually related to some sort of attribute or some sort of thing that he has done, that they add another title to, right? And so the names are actually pretty important because, we've talked on this before and in other series. The whole point of the Bible is for us to know God, right? It's not just a rule book or a book of poetry. These are genres. These are like different types of writing that maybe we interact with, but it's ultimately God attempting to help us know Him with our human limitations, right? And so one of the things that one of the devices that the Bible uses to help us to know God are these names, these titles for Him. And so that's the whole point of the series. Like, I hope at the end of it we've got a better understanding of who God is, what His character is, what types of things does He think are important, what does He do, and post-Easter I think that's a really important thing. We don't just worship a generalized God, like He's revealed Himself in these ways, and so to connect with our hearts on that is really important.
Yeah, I'm excited for this series and also a little confused. Yeah. Because there's a lot of really confusing titles that we're going to see in this series. Are these aren't English titles?
They are not.
Right?
Yeah, they are not.
and I received some feedback like, hey, what translation is Pastor Eric using? Because I don't see that in my Bible.
Yes.
Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the unfortunate parts of Bible translation is, if you were to read, say, the book of Genesis in Hebrew, right? These names are given and then they get translated into Lord or God. Even one of them, the translator, the two names can mean, two names that are given can mean Lord, Lord. If you just translate them like that. And so even that, the translators were like, oh, well, we can't do that. That's too repetitive, even though that's maybe the more literal way of doing it. So we made it Almighty Lord or Almighty, And so, with that one would have been, I think it was Adonai Yahweh. Adonai meaning Lord, like you're the master, I'm the servant. Yahweh we translate to Lord for some reason, even though that's the personal name that God gives in the book of Exodus. So the translators to different languages, but especially our English translations today, don't give the nuance that these names, if they were written in their original Hebrew, right? Even the name changes from in the New Testament from Saul to Paul. People are like, ooh, what's the mystery behind this? Well, Saul is a Hebrew name. Paul is a Roman citizen name, and he is to minister to the Romans. So that's why he goes by Paul after that, right? There's something significant there. Like there's something significant to his calling, but we just go, oh, his name's changed. That's weird, Peter. His name is Simon. And all of a sudden Jesus is like, you're Peter now. And like, all right, but why does he do that? Like, and so, that's one of the reasons I want to do this series, is that we miss so much nuance when we just open up the Bible as if it's any other book and just say, oh, I can read this because it's in my language and it's using words that I can understand, and that's good. I'm glad we have that. But there's so much more that went into that text than just, you know, a simple book that you can sit down and read and totally understand what's going on in the context it came out of. So, yeah, a lot of these names are going to be, most of them are going to be Hebrew. There's going to be some that are Greek. And then they don't quite get translated. You know, in the New Testament, and this is also important, in the New Testament, we don't see, because it's in Greek, we don't see the name Yahweh show up. We get Kyrios, Lord, right? We don't see these many different creative names because for whatever reason, that's just not how the Greek language works. So we have the word for Lord, and we have the word for God, Theos, and that's about it. That's pretty much what you get. But you get a lot more creativity when it comes to Jesus and his titles and his names and what's ascribed to him. And so it's a cool shift that all of a sudden that happens in the New Testament. So it's a long way of saying the Bible wasn't written in English, and it wasn't written in, you know, the last, you know, 50 years so that it speaks directly to our culture. It was written in a totally different time and place and language and culture, and so we have to do more translation work than just this word means this word, or this is the closest thing. Like, there's more in the text than just the words.
Well, you and I aren't Bible translators, right? But there was a Bible translation that came out in 2020 that's a fairly word-for-word NASB, right? Why don't we get that nuance? Like, why should we get our torches and pitchforks and track down the Bible translators? Like, hey, why didn't you get that nuance?
No, I think most Bible translations, the attempt is to make it readable for a target audience, right? Okay. That's why there's a UK version of the NIV, because you know, like, instead of, you know, Jesus sat down and cooked fish, it's fish and chips. That's the dumbest joke I've ever told. Jesus showed up and he's like, "Hey, Gov."
Oh no!
All of our British people are gonna hate us. None of you are going to hate us.
We just got canceled in Britain.
Because even the English language is not a monolith. The way that people speak English in Australia, Ireland, the South States, you know, in the U.S., Louisiana, go to New Orleans. They're speaking English, but you don't understand it, right? And so, like, language is just very tricky. And if the goal is, and probably should be, to make this understandable for the readers, then I see why they leave it out. And that's why I think it's good to read from multiple translations. You know, I have a couple that I go to for, you know, primary study, but then I use this Names of God translation. I don't think it's the best translation in terms of you know, a word for word translation. But it includes these names for God that are really helpful. And so I use it as a supplement. I'm using it to preach in the series so that people can get, and even as I'm doing that, I get frustrated because as I was, you know, talking about, you know, the Genesis 2 narrative where, you know, the creation story that we hear there is that Adam, you know, is put into a deep sleep by God, and God takes a rib. And I actually saw on social media the other day, adults who are like trying to figure out, do I still want to follow Jesus because I have all this stuff that was handed to me that doesn't make any sense? And they were like, yeah, I was in my 20s when I finally learned that men don't have one less rib than women. Because that's what I was told, that's a thing, because that's what the story told. First of all, hilarious and harmful. Like, it's this weird mix of, like, dang, you know, we carry things that seem harmless, but actually, like, it makes people question, like, well, what's really going on here if that's not what it is? And it comes down to a bad translation of what that word is. It's actually side, not rib. The idea is to say that Adam, which means, you know, means two things. It means humankind and man of red earth, right? Adam, mankind, is now humankind, including womankind, Eve, the mother of life, right? So when you take that translation, you take rib, and you put rib there instead of side, you lose a lot. You lose a ton. And you get people then going, well, then men must have one less rib than women, and we just believe that into our 20s, even though you could just count like 1, 2, 3, you know. Right. So all that to say, like, I don't think there's anything malicious going on in these translation things. I think it's really hard. I mean, we're taking texts that are over, 2,000 years old, written to an audience that, the original audience is not us, with cultural understandings, and language evolves over time. We talk about Greek, we're talking biblical Greek, right? Which is different than if you go to Greece right now. There's tons of similarities, but tons of differences. And, read Chaucer, and the Old English, or maybe it's Middle English. I don't even know, I forget. It was a long time ago when I studied Chaucer. But yeah, go read Canterbury Tales and go, yes, this is the same language I speak today, but it's English. It was English. And so it's a really hard thing to do, and if we want people to have an accessible Bible in their hands and to read the Bible for themselves, it's not a shocker that some things get lost in translation. And to be fair, this is not it's not a limitation of the Bible necessarily, it's a limitation of humanity. Language can only do so much, and language, there are rules with language, but there's no abiding by the rules. It changes, it moves, and I remember growing up like, I before E except after C, and then all these other cases too. And you're like, then that's not a rule, right? Like it's just, it made it up. So, yeah, I think translators are doing their best for the most part. I think there's some translations that are pretty wonky in terms of trying to just force their theology into it instead of getting theology from the Bible. We're like, well, we're going to write it into the text. That's bad. But I think most are trying to faithfully help people get to the heart of the text.
A helpful statistic that I heard from the Bible Project actually was that the Bible is comprised of about 50% narrative.
Yes.
Right? About a third of it is poetry, and then the remainder of it is something called prose discourse, which is basically just conversations, sermons, things like that.
Yes, absolutely.
None of that is science.
None of that is science.
Right, and so it's not meant to be a textbook of science talking about the biology of the ribs or the creation, literal creation.
Not
of
at
the
all.
earth. Yeah. So
I think it's one of the most important things for people to understand, like, why is the author writing this is such an important question to ask when you read the Bible. Because there's what it says in our English translation, and then there's what was going on when it was happening, who was it to, how does that language, what are the nuances of that language, what are the people around them, like what was the general culture like, both in the religious and in the secular world. And then you can start to get at the heart of, like, why did God want this in this book? And why did this author write it? And why did they write it this way? And that's when you find out what the Bible means, right? And so when you read a text like Genesis 1, it is a type of poetry that's not found anywhere else in the Bible. It's beautiful, it's awesome, but it's poetry. Right, and I don't typically go to poets for my science, right? And the same thing is true, like, say, the Psalms. I don't like to take systematic theology from the Psalms because the psalmists, admittedly, are writing from feeling and experience, not necessarily an objective reality, right? And that's okay. We're human, and that's how we process life and God and all of that. And so. If you just sit down and read a page of scripture, you might go, oh, this says this, this, and this, and this. But if you don't know anything else about it, it might not be saying that at all. And sometimes it might be saying the opposite. And that's what's crazy, is that, like, when you dig into it, it can be way more complicated, but actually way more rich, too. And so it's worth doing the work.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us. If you want to hear more from Pastor Eric about Genesis 1 and 2, which we didn't discuss at all in this Midweek mashup, then you might want to click that banner. But thank you so much for going into a little bit of Bible translation. If you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment down below, and we'll take a look at those and If you would like to tune in for more, then here are some videos for you to watch now.